all of the things that I do end up being something about like bringing women's voices back, bringing women's lives back, putting women's stories back in the conversation where they belonged all along. It's ridiculous that you can go all the way through high school having heard of about 10 women in your history classes. My sister's a history professor, and we had been talking for quite a while about doing a project together, something about women's history, this overlap in our interests. And we had vaguely talked about the idea of a podcast, because at this point, podcasting is still in that phase of, do you know what a podcast is? And one of the options that Katie brought up was that she really wanted to do a podcast about the women who have been left out. All of the women you never heard of who should be in our history books but aren't. And I frankly thought that was a terrible idea. I know how hard it is to get people interested in women's history in the first place. And trying to sell a podcast about, hey, here's a podcast about a bunch of people you've never heard of, just seemed really difficult to me. And I was walking around Columbia Cemetery and I stumbled on this gravestone that just said mother. Didn't have a name, it had mother and then the dates. And the total erasure of this woman's identity really upset me for some reason at this point. And I've seen plenty of these graves before, but it really bothered me. And on the way out of the cemetery, I called Katie and said, all right, let's do it. We're doing it. We're reclaiming these women. And we spent the next 6 months really kind of refining, figuring out, what is this going to be? How is this going to work? What is this going to look like? My career, I think, just has all of these different pieces that all fit into the same box. And all of the things that I do end up being something about like bringing women's voices back, bringing women's lives back, putting women's stories back in the conversation where they belonged all along. We release an episode every 2 weeks, and we alternate. So the format is that either Katie or I will do an interview with someone who is an expert on some woman who has been forgotten. Our tagline is Fascinating Women You've Never Heard Of. And it's a very highly produced, sort of NPR-ish, we're told, podcast we always use period music, and it's a really highly edited, crafted story about this woman's life. What we really want to accomplish is making all of this knowledge accessible, useful to everybody, that you could be a graduate student in history, or a stay-at-home mom, or a high school student, or just a person who is interested in learning about people, and you're going to find this enjoyable and entertaining and educational and fun. We knew going in, that's why we did the podcast, that there were so many women to talk about and so many women who've done these amazing things throughout history. We keep finding more, and we keep finding so many. We could make this podcast for the next 10,000 years and never run out of subjects. So when Katie and I launched the podcast, we had a very long discussion about, okay, how do we decide if we keep doing this? What does success look like? If we can get 50 people consistently listening to the podcast, that will be worth it, and we will keep doing it as long as like 50 people are listening. And I think we just hit 1.2 million downloads last week, so people are listening. So a month ago, on April 5th, we had our first book come out, which is called The Book of Sisters, and it is a middle grade children's nonfiction, so like aimed at 8 to 12-year-olds, but it's good for everybody, and we've been told by many adults that they are loving it as well. And we decided to take on this ridiculously ambitious and maybe impossible project of telling an entire history of the world through the stories of sisters. And some of them are incredible heroes, and some are terrible, terrible people that you should not emulate. Just, again, shaking that foundation of who gets to matter, who gets to be talked about, who gets to be seen as important in the story of the entire history of humanity. It's not just public history. It's not just national history where we need to put the women back. We need to put the women back in our own family histories and our own family stories that we often are tracing back our genealogy, and there's only men mentioned. We've been trained to believe that. We've been trained to dismiss the things that women do, the things that women are interested in, women's work, women's subjects as not very important and not as good and not as skillful. Women have always been doing things. There have never been a time when women weren't doing stuff. And the narrative that we've all been told of, well, it's not their fault, but women just weren't allowed to. But it's not true. They have always been doing it. Women have always been making art, always been making history, always been writing, always been ruling. Women have always been there, and it's just a matter of putting them back in the story where they belong. It's a really interesting time to teach women's and gender studies right now. A wonderful and terrible time. There's so much material. It can be really depressing sometimes, and it can feel like we're just moving backwards, right? We're not making any progress. We're fighting the same fight that my grandmother was fighting. But it's also really reassuring to see the places where we are making progress. Like the students that I'm teaching now, the Gen Z students, are remarkable. I mean, they're so much more aware, they're so much more informed. So I have a lot of hope that they can make a huge difference. And if we can just get them into the realms of power where decisions are made, we could fix a lot of things pretty quickly.